games. I think I would probably have to sit back and kind of go, yeah, I don't know if I really enjoy this. But for me, being someone that came of age as video games were also kind of coming of age at the same time. I mean, the real maturity, and I use that word lightly, by the way, that's come into the gaming world has really come along. You know, it's kind of matches my generation of gamers, and I think that, you know, as someone that grew up in that era, something like a point-and-click adventure game really did a lot to suck us in, to bring us into the experience and create that kind of immersion that so many other gaming genres have used since then. And even if you look at some of those old text games, that's exactly what they were doing. They were really taking the kind of D&D experience, and instead of putting it into an RPG where you level and all those kinds of things, kind of pulling it into, you know, you have entered a room. It is dark and wet and cold, and you know, to your right you see a window, and you see what I'm saying? It's very immersive by nature. Whereas something like an FPS requires a lot of action and a lot of motion and a lot of movement to really draw you in. The narrative and the immersion of scenery, sensory perception, those kinds of things are really what adventure games go to. And so, you know, I understand why people would not like point-and-click adventures. They do have the tendency to be kind of boring, especially if you're going to watch them or watch someone play them, right? Although I'll tell you, there are some great playthroughs on YouTube. If you ever, you know, if you're never going to get a chance to go back and play some of the old Roberta Williams type games, right? Sierra Online, so it was some of which the Male White Mage actually named. Go to YouTube and watch them. They're, you know, 6 or 7 part features sometimes. And Spoony, for example, has one of my favorite Let's Plays of all time with Phantasmagoria 2, I believe. It's just very, very well done. And Spoony, of course, is his wonderful and jovial, funny self. So you guys should definitely check that out. Never mind plugging some of the folks that helped to inspire the Clan of the Grey Wolf, and Spoony is definitely one of those folks. So check that one out, SpoonyExperiment.com. Let's see, how about Shirao Wolf talked about something I thought that was really interesting, and several of you echoed these sentiments, that really, talking about genre is almost difficult to do in terms of favorite, least favorite, best, worst, so on and so forth, because any genre can really be fun, and any genre can really produce great games and can really produce terrible games. And I think that's probably true. You know, think about some of the games that we played as we were kids that we'd probably look at as a genre that might be not so much fun anymore. Like Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? You'd think that that was only entertaining to kids. I don't think that's the case. I think if you really look at some of the elements of something like a Carmen Sandiego, it's very alive and well, especially in something like Heavy Rain or Alan Wake, right? Where, and I know that that's a little bit of a stretch considering the discrepancies between the two, or the disparate nature of the two games, but bear with me for a second. When you really go through what the experiences of those games really are, right? Forget the fact for a second that Carmen Sandiego is really meant as an educational game, but the fact that it's got a fun factor to it, right? And the fun factor, I think, springs from the same place in both of those examples, a Heavy Rain or a Carmen Sandiego. And I think there are great examples. Think of, you know, if we're going to stick with FPS, there are some great FPS games out there, right? Some really, really great pieces of work. I think we talked about GoldenEye before. GoldenEye is a great story in time, a great snapshot of how good an FPS can be, circa 1997, right? Now look back, right, and look at something that's just awful, like Daikatana, for example, for N64, to keep it in that one generation. You have the best and the worst right there. Daikatana was slow, it was awful, it didn't really give a great experience, it was almost impossible to control, the weapons weren't engaging, there was no real fun factor, so on and so forth, right? So, in other words, folks, I think I can get really behind this initiative from Shirao Wolf that Genres can be fun, regardless of what the kind of factors are about them. And I think if we're looking at what classical genres really means, way back, even to the ancients, that makes a lot of sense, right? Genres are not meant to be classified, as better or worse. Some of them could be more compelling than others, let's say, but it's never about being kind of, this kind of hierarchical, step. I guess comparison between the two, that one will be better or worse than the other. It just doesn't work that way. So, I think any genre can be fun. I think any genre can be awful. What we're really looking at, though, is a kind of pattern. And I think that is undeniable as well. A lot of X certain kinds of games happen to be good. A lot of X genre games happen to be pretty bad. There are patterns here, folks. And, the patterns are what, I guess, really rains down upon this particular question for the Weekly Ringer. Chris Pranger, Prangerade, talked about fighting games. And I have to say, this was a good one that I had to think about a lot, because you have to understand, also, being from this particular generation of millennials, I have to say, fighting games were a big reason that I came to video gaming in the first place. When I was young and would go to arcades, there was always Virtua Fighter, there was Street Fighter, there was Mortal Kombat, and any of the other ones too, right? Soul Calibur, so on and so forth. There were so many great fighting games, and I love the concept so much that I just wanted to keep playing. I know Mortal Kombat was one of those things that just drew me in so much. But I completely understand what Prangerade is talking about here. The idea that they're impossible to master. There's a ton of them now. And the difficulty, the barrier of entry is really very high. The bar is set very high. Now, I know that there have been several attempts to kind of level the playing field of late, but I would still say that those games are very, very, very difficult to beat. I remember just being so upset at some of the Street Fighter games, or Marvel versus Capcom, so on and so forth, where these games were just impossible. You could beat one person, and then you go on to the next one, and they were just impossible. Basically, they made you spend an extra quarter, and then they would give you a victory, and then you know what I mean. It was just kind of a tactic to keep making you burn money in the arcade. That's cool in the arcade. I get it. But if you put that into the console world, it was just awful, man. Like I hated that idea, and it made me just throw a lot of controllers and get really pissed off. So I do understand how fighting games have evolved. I get kind of why they are what they are, and maybe I just don't get it. Maybe I don't get it, and maybe Chris Pranger doesn't get it. But I have to say, sometimes it's just really infuriating to play a fighting game and feel like all you're really there to do is just punch a bunch of buttons. Man, that was a weird phrase. Try saying that one 10 times fast. A lot of times, just pounding the controller basically, and that was the only way I was able to win in a lot of cases. So I think any game that makes you do that is probably not going to be my favorite. Let's see. Matthias, one of the new folks to our contributing commentary community. Also, Triple C, love that. Weird. It's happening with my alliteration today. But Matthias makes some very interesting points. Some that I think I can get behind, some of them that I think I can't. But rather than kind of hash out, I think it's a great comment. These are the kind of comments I envisioned when I started thinking about the Weekly Ringer, right? I love all of your comments. That's something that goes without saying. But I thought this was a particularly good one. There's a lot to think about in this. Matthias talks about rhythm games and MMORPGs as being the least favorite. And there are a couple reasons why. both of them, I think, Matthias looks at their simulation nature, right? In other words, how they represent reality in some way. And the concept of both of those kinds of games being a bit too shallow in their simulation, almost in a mocking of reality kind of a way. For example, watch the Guitar Hero episode of South Park, right? Where you have the kind of craze that's going on with Rock Band, Guitar Hero, all those kinds of things. Where you have peripheral mania, where you have people that would otherwise just be having a party and otherwise just drinking, and instead now they're drinking with plastic instruments in their hands. And if you weren't listening to the music and if you weren't watching the screen and you were just looking at them playing, you'd probably think they were absolutely insane. But then again, couldn't you probably say that for almost every video game? I think so. If you've ever watched Rue's mom play Mario Kart, you would know exactly what I mean by that. People do look ridiculous sometimes when they play video games. Don't tell them I said that, guys. Anyway, so I think this is an interesting point. Being too shallow in terms of the simulation, I think is a good point. It's something I can definitely understand. You know, in other words, the way that they play, it's almost a mockery of reality. It's almost kind of at the expense of reality. I don't know why that necessarily is a bad thing, and I don't know necessarily why that makes rhythm games a poor genre, or makes MMORPGs a poor genre specifically, but I'll go through them as I see them. Rhythm games, I think the argument is more compelling. With rhythm games, it's really only a one-trick pony. And what's interesting about rhythm games is how the folks that developed rhythm games kind of started out in a very basic place, ended up in a place that was, I think, a lot more grandiose and large, but it also didn't quite meet the standard. It didn't quite, the innovation curve was a bell curve, right? There was only so much you could do with the rhythm genre, and after you had done it, there was nothing else to do. What else is there to do in rhythm games that hasn't been done already? I'm not saying there isn't anything, but I'm saying that it's diminishing returns. For the amount of money that it takes to make a rhythm game, people just got a little bit tired of it. Now, one thing I do love about something like a rhythm game, especially with Rock Band and Guitar Hero, is that it's brought really great music to the forefront. I know folks that are younger that would have no idea who the Beatles were, or who, maybe not the Beatles, that's probably going to extremes, but knowing who Led Zeppelin were, or knowing who the Queen was, right? Or any of these groups that I think of as just classics. If you don't know those things, what do you know about music? And the only reason they know them, and the only reason that stations started playing their songs again, was because of Guitar Hero. It's because of Rock Band, right? And that happens quite a bit, and I think that's really cool. But the rhythm genre kind of ran its course, and it's dying off pretty quickly now, even on some of the other things like smartphones and other things that I think make it complicated. But for a while there, that's all there was, and I just cannot understand why. Wow. But the experience was cool to begin with, and I think that's undeniable. I don't think the reason that rhythm games as a genre have depleted is because of their lack of, or because of the shallowness of their simulation. I think it has to do more with being a one-trick pony. If you go into FPS and look at the way that FPS has been over the last 25 years, you will see definitive moments of innovation that change the genre. We've talked about that before in the Weekly Wringer. You're not going to find that in rhythm games. You're just not. It is a one-trick pony, and it's very difficult to get past that. Now, let's go to MMORPGs. Because MMORPGs are almost a completely, in one sense, they're just the offshoot of RPGs, which we all know and love. Well, maybe not all know and love, but I don't think anybody out there said the RPG genre was awful. Some folks said JRPGs, and some people talked about, MMORPGs, but I don't think anybody said that RPGs were altogether bad, although I could understand why someone would feel that way. I do understand why people wouldn't like RPGs to some degree. I think that we're a little bit biased because most of the people